A philosopher's son became a priest, then abandoned God, then joined the Nazis, and somehow wrote a book that changed how we understand existence itself. Martin Heidegger spent his entire life asking one question: what does it mean to be? The answer he found would reshape Western thought and leave a stain on philosophy that's never washed clean. September 26th, 1889. The Black Forest region of southern Germany. A baby boy enters a world where church bells mark every hour, where the rhythms of agricultural life dictate the passage of seasons, where God's presence isn't questioned because questioning itself seems foreign. His father, Friedrich Heidegger, works 2 jobs. He's a master cooper, crafting barrels with hands that understand wood the way most people understand language. He's also the sexton of St. Martin's Church, maintaining the building, ringing the bells, preparing the space for Mass. The family is poor, not destitute, but the kind of poor where every pfennig matters, where opportunities are scarce, where your station in life feels predetermined by forces beyond your control. They name him Martin, the same name as the church his father serves, the same name as the Protestant reformer who split Christianity centuries earlier. Names carry weight in Meßkirch, this quiet Swabian town where everyone knows everyone and nothing much changes from year to year. Young Martin grows up surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and incense. The workshop where his father shapes barrels sits adjacent to the church, where prayers rise like smoke. It's a world of craft and devotion, of hands and souls, of making things and making meaning. The church bells become the metronome of his childhood. They announce births and deaths, festivals and fasts, the beginning of work days and the call to prayer. Time itself seems to flow from those bells, structuring existence in a way that feels natural, ancient, unchangeable. The Heidegger household is devoutly Catholic, not casually religious, devout. They attend Mass regularly. They observe the fasts. They pray before meals and before bed. The liturgical calendar shapes their lives more concretely than any secular calendar ever could. Martin absorbs this atmosphere completely. He serves as an altar boy, learning the Latin responses, understanding the rituals not as performances, but as access points to something transcendent. His parents see something in him, intelligence certainly, but also a quality harder to name, a seriousness, an intensity. Other children play in the streets without apparent purpose. Martin seems always to be observing, absorbing, thinking. When he reads, he disappears into the text completely. When he attends Mass, he's not fidgeting or daydreaming. He's present in a way that suggests genuine engagement with the mystery unfolding before him. The obvious path reveals itself. This boy should become a priest. In 1903, at 14 years old, Martin Heidegger enters the residential seminary. The church provides a scholarship because his family certainly can't afford it. He's sent to high school in Constance, then in 1906 to Freiburg, where the training intensifies. He masters the logic of Thomas Aquinas, that medieval synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. He receives the sacraments of Eucharist and confession on bended knee, fully invested in the system that's shaping him. But something happens during these years that will redirect everything. At 17, he encounters a book, On the Manifold Meaning of Being According to Aristotle, by Franz Brentano. It's an academic text, dense and technical, exploring how Aristotle used the word being in different ways. For most teenagers, this would be impenetrable, boring, completely irrelevant to anything that matters. For Martin Heidegger, it's an earthquake. The question explodes in his mind. What does it mean to be? Not what does this particular thing exist as? Or how do we categorize different types of existence? The fundamental question. Being itself. The fact that there is something rather than nothing. Why is this question not the first question everyone asks? Why does it seem to have been forgotten, buried under centuries of theological and philosophical systems that take being for granted? He joins the League of the Grail, an evangelical wing of the Catholic youth movement. He writes polemical articles defending traditional faith against the corruption of modernity. He attacks Oscar Wilde and Nietzsche, those symbols of individualistic excess. He condemns what he sees as the narcissistic cult of personality overtaking European culture. At this stage, he's still firmly within the Catholic worldview. He believes the Übermensch can be redeemed through supernatural grace and theological wisdom. He's committed to what he calls the transcendental value of life, a trinity of faith, tradition, and something beyond mere secular existence. Then 1909 arrives. Heidegger enters a Jesuit seminary. The path seems clear. He's brilliant, devout, perfectly suited for a life of religious service and intellectual work within the church. Within weeks, he's discharged. The official reason? Heart trouble. Here's what's strange. He never has heart problems again. Not during his long life, not during the physically demanding years ahead. Some historians wonder whether the Jesuits saw something else, a restlessness, a tendency toward questions that might prove dangerous, a mind that couldn't quite submit to the required obedience. We'll never know for certain. What we know is that a door closes and another opens. He enrolls at the University of Freiburg. Initially, he studies Catholic theology, alongside natural sciences and mathematics. The range suggests someone still searching, not yet committed to a single path. Then in 1911, everything crystallizes. He abandons training for the priesthood entirely. He discovers Edmund Husserl's logical investigations, and phenomenology becomes his new religion. What is phenomenology? Imagine trying to describe your experience of seeing a red apple without assuming anything about the apple's existence, the nature of redness, or how vision works. You'd focus purely on the experience itself, the appearing of red, the sense of roundness, the phenomenon as it presents itself to consciousness. Husserl developed a rigorous method for doing exactly this, bracketing all assumptions and examining pure experience. For someone raised in a world of absolute truths and divine revelation, this approach is intoxicating. It promises certainty not through faith or tradition, but through careful attention to how things show themselves. It takes nothing for granted. It starts from the ground up. Heidegger throws himself into philosophical work with the intensity he once reserved for theology. In 1913, he defends his dissertation on psychologism, earning his doctorate summa cum laude. The thesis examines how judgments work, how we make claims about reality, how logic relates to psychology. It's technically brilliant, but not yet distinctive. He's still learning the craft, mastering the existing debates before launching his own revolution. 2 years later, in 1915, he completes his habilitation thesis on Duns Scotus, the medieval scholastic theologian. This qualification allows him to teach at university level in Germany. The work is directed by Heinrich Rickert, a neo-Kantian, but it's deeply influenced by Husserl's phenomenology. Heidegger is building a bridge between medieval thought and cutting-edge contemporary philosophy. He's showing how questions about being and categories that preoccupied scholastic thinkers connect to phenomenological investigations of consciousness and meaning. The academic world takes notice. Here's a young scholar who combines extraordinary erudition with genuine originality. He knows the tradition inside and out, but he's not content to merely comment on it. He's searching for something. Then comes 1916. Heidegger begins studying classical Protestant texts, Luther, Calvin, the reformers who broke with Rome. He's reading them seriously, not as a Catholic examining heresy, but as someone genuinely engaging with their insights. And something breaks. The rigid dogma of Catholicism starts feeling like a cage. The certainties he was raised with seem less certain. The answers provided by tradition begin to feel like obstacles to genuine questioning. Between 1916 and 1919, He moves toward liberal Protestantism. By the 1920s, he appears to have abandoned faith altogether, at least in any conventional sense. Yet he never stops engaging with religious and spiritual questions. They're woven into everything he writes, these concerns about meaning and transcendence and what, if anything, grounds human existence. In 1917, he makes his break official by marrying Elfriede Petri, a Lutheran. They have a Catholic ceremony, then a Protestant ceremony a week later. It's symbolic. He's standing between worlds, unwilling to fully reject his roots, but unable to remain within them. They have a son, Jörg. The domestic life of a young academic family begins. But Heidegger's personal transformation mirrors something deeper happening in his thought. He's no longer asking theological questions about God and salvation. He's asking philosophical questions about being and existence. The shift seems subtle. It's actually seismic. Starting in 1919, he lectures at Freiburg and becomes the heir apparent to Husserl's phenomenological movement. But he's already transforming phenomenology into something Husserl barely recognizes. He extends the concept of subject to the dimension of history and concrete existence. He finds precedents in Christian thinkers, Paul, Augustine, Luther, Kierkegaard, these figures who emphasize the individual's subjective relation to truth. He reads Wilhelm Dilthey and develops what he calls a hermeneutics of factical life. Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. Factical life is the concrete, situated, always already interpreted existence that we find ourselves thrown into. We don't start from a neutral position and then add interpretations. We're always already interpreting, always already embedded in a world that has meaning before we consciously think about it. This becomes the foundation of everything. Heidegger isn't interested in abstract consciousness contemplating eternal truths. He's interested in human beings who are always already in the middle of things, dealing with practical concerns, navigating social relationships, understanding themselves through the possibilities available in their historical moment. We don't have a relationship to being. We are that relationship. The influences pile up. Kierkegaard's emphasis on anxiety, mortality, and passionate individuality. Nietzsche's critique of Western metaphysics. Dilthey's historical consciousness. All of it gets filtered through Heidegger's emerging vision of what philosophy should be doing. In 1923, at age 34, he receives an appointment as associate professor at the University of Marburg. He publishes almost nothing during these years. His reputation spreads through his teaching alone. Students who attend his lectures describe an experience unlike anything else in German academia. He doesn't lecture in the traditional sense, reading prepared notes in a monotone. He thinks aloud. He struggles with concepts in real time. He makes his audience feel like they're witnessing philosophy happen rather than receiving finished doctrines. Hannah Arendt, who will become one of the most important political philosophers of the 20th century, later describes Heidegger's reputation as like a rumour of a hidden king. That phrase captures something essential. He's working in relative obscurity at a provincial university, but everyone who matters knows something extraordinary is happening in his classrooms. What are they hearing? What's creating this legendary status? Heidegger is teaching them to see the familiar as strange. A hammer is not just an object with properties, it's equipment embedded in a whole network of purposes and practices. You don't first perceive a hammer as a thing and then assign it a use. You encounter it as already meaningful within your projects. The world isn't a collection of objects we observe from outside. It's the context we're always already navigating from within. This sounds simple. It demolishes 2,000 years of philosophical assumptions about subjects and objects, minds and matter, consciousness and reality. Every student who truly grasps what Heidegger is saying realizes they have to rethink everything they thought they knew about how humans relate to the world. The lectures continue, the reputation grows, and slowly, methodically, Heidegger is working towards something. a book that will justify his growing fame. A systematic presentation of ideas that have been percolating for years. A work that will force the philosophical establishment to recognize that something genuinely new has arrived. He's writing it in fragments, testing ideas in lectures, refining his terminology, building toward what he calls fundamental ontology, the question of being. Not beings, the particular things that exist. Being itself, the ground that makes any existence possible. By 1926, the manuscript is taking shape. He's racing against a deadline. The university system requires publications for promotion to full professor. If he doesn't produce something substantial soon, his career will stall. The pressure is intense, the stakes couldn't be higher. In April 1927, a book appears in German bookstores that will change philosophy forever. Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, 400 pages of dense, difficult German prose introducing concepts that don't exist in any previous philosophical vocabulary. The title is deceptively simple. What could be more basic than being and time? But Heidegger isn't asking simple questions about what things are or how time passes. He's asking why there are things at all. What does it mean for anything to be? This isn't abstract speculation. For Heidegger, the question of being has been forgotten. Western philosophy, since Plato, has studied beings, particular things that exist, but lost sight of being itself, the ground that makes existence possible. Imagine you're in a workshop. You see tools everywhere, hammers, saws, planes. Traditional philosophy would analyze these objects. What properties do they have? What's their essence? How do we know they're real? Heidegger says this approach misses everything important. The hammer isn't first an object you observe and then decide to use. You encounter it already embedded in a world of purposes. It's for hammering, which is for building, which is for shelter. The hammer only makes sense within this network of meaningful activities. He calls this equipment, not objects with properties, but things that show up as already meaningful within your projects. You don't have a relationship to equipment. You're using it before you think about it. This is being in the world. The hyphenations matter. You're not a subject in here, looking at objects out there. You're already out there, involved, dealing with things that matter. The technical term is Dasein, literally being there, not human being or consciousness or subject. Those words carry too much baggage. Dasein is the entity that we ourselves are, the being for whom being itself is an issue. You care about your existence. You have to be something. Make decisions. Choose who you'll become. No animal faces this. A rock doesn't wonder what it means to be a rock. You wonder what it means to be you. The book's first division analyzes everyday existence, how Dasein typically understands itself. Most of the time, you're absorbed in tasks, writing emails, making coffee, taking the train. You're not reflecting on your existence, you're just doing things. Heidegger calls this the they self, das Man. You do what one does, wear what one wears, think what one thinks. This isn't critique, it's description. Everyday existence is mostly living according to average public norms. But something can disrupt this. Anxiety, not fear of something specific. Anxiety is the mood where the whole familiar world becomes strange. Nothing threatens you, yet everything feels unstable. The meanings you took for granted suddenly seem arbitrary. In anxiety, you confront your existence as your own. Not something inherited from others, but something you must take responsibility for. Heidegger calls this authenticity, not being yourself in some romantic sense, recognizing that you are the one who must be. Death becomes crucial here, not as a medical event, but as the possibility that's always yours. You can delegate tasks to others. You cannot delegate dying. It's the one possibility that makes all your other possibilities finite. Living authentically means living in relation to this finitude. Not morbidly obsessing about death, but recognizing that your time is limited and therefore what you do matters. The analysis goes deeper. All of this is grounded in temporality. Time isn't something in which you exist, you're temporal. Your being is stretched between past, present, and future. You're always ahead of yourself, projected toward possibilities, always already in a past that shapes what's possible, always presently dealing with things around you. This threefold structure of temporality is what makes Dasein's being possible. Traditional philosophy thought about time as a sequence of now points, past moments that no longer exist, future moments that don't exist yet, and a present moment that somehow is. Heidegger says, this misses how time actually works in lived experience. You're writing an email. The present act only makes sense because you're projecting toward its completion while drawing on your understanding of email conventions. Past, present, and future are equiprimordial, simultaneous dimensions of a single temporal structure. This temporal analysis was supposed to ground the question of being itself. Division 2 of being and time points toward this larger project. But the book ends abruptly, incomplete. The promised third division never appears. The reception is immediate and explosive. Here's philosophy that speaks to concrete human existence, that takes seriously anxiety, death, authenticity, that doesn't reduce life to abstract principles. Existentialist readers embrace it. Finally, a philosopher who addresses what it means to exist rather than spinning theories about eternal truths. The book becomes central to existentialism, even though Heidegger will later insist he's not an existentialist. Phenomenologists recognize a radical extension of Husserl's method. Heidegger has taken phenomenology beyond consciousness to existence itself, but Husserl himself grows troubled. This isn't what he meant by phenomenology. Professional philosophers struggle with the book. The language is forbidding. New terms appear on every page. Heidegger isn't just proposing new ideas, he's creating an entirely new philosophical vocabulary. Why? Because ordinary language, he claims, is saturated with metaphysical assumptions that prevent thinking being properly. You can't use traditional terms without importing the mistakes of traditional metaphysics. So he coins words: Dasein, Geworfenheit, thrownness, Entwurf, projection, Verfallen, falling, Sorge, care, Sein zum Tode, being toward death. Each term is carefully constructed to avoid old errors. Critics complain this makes him incomprehensible. Heidegger's response: philosophy shouldn't be easy. If you can understand it immediately using familiar concepts, you're not thinking anything new. The book's influence spreads rapidly. Within years, it's being discussed across Europe. Translations begin. French philosophers discover it in the 30s. Jean-Paul Sartre's entire project grows from engagement with being and time. But something else is happening in Heidegger's life. Something that will forever complicate his legacy and raise questions about the relationship between philosophy and politics. In 1928, his mentor Husserl retires from the chair of philosophy at Freiburg. The position is prestigious, one of the most important in German philosophy. Heidegger is the obvious successor. He returns to Freiburg as professor, now at the institution where his career began. The inaugural lecture is titled "What is Metaphysics?" It's vintage Heidegger asking about nothing. Not particular absences, but the nothing itself. How can we ask about what isn't? Through anxiety again. In anxiety, beings as a whole become strange, and the nothing reveals itself, not as something, but as the background against which anything can appear. Traditional logic says you can't think about nothing because thinking requires an object. Heidegger says logic itself rests on a prior encounter with being, and nothing that makes logical thinking possible. The audience is bewildered. Some are thrilled by the daring, others think he's abandoned rigorous philosophy for mysticism. The logical positivists, then gaining influence, cite the lecture as proof that metaphysics is meaningless nonsense. Rudolf Carnap writes a famous essay dissecting Heidegger's nothing talk as grammatical confusion. If nothing is no-thing, then the sentence, "the nothing nothings," is gibberish. Heidegger has mistaken linguistic forms for ontological insights. The divide between analytic and continental philosophy, still visible today, has one of its origins in this clash. Two communities speaking different languages, pursuing different goals, barely able to communicate. Heidegger doesn't engage. He's not interested in logical analysis. He's asking questions logic can't address, because logic presupposes answers to them. His work continues. In 1929, he publishes Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, reinterpreting Kant's first critique through the lens of temporality. Kant, Heidegger argues, almost discovered that time grounds all understanding, but pulled back from the insight. The lectures continue. His courses attract students from across Germany and beyond. Hannah Arendt has returned to Germany after time in Marburg. Emmanuel Levinas arrives from France. Each will become major philosophers in their own right. The teaching remains extraordinary. Students describe feeling like the floor drops away, like they're thinking thoughts that were previously unthinkable. Heidegger has a way of making familiar concepts seem strange, and strange concepts seem inevitable. But beneath this philosophical success, something darker is stirring. Germany in 1930 is fragmenting. The Weimar Republic is failing. Economic collapse, political violence, rising extremism. The National Socialists are gaining power. Heidegger, who has been almost entirely apolitical, begins paying attention. He starts believing something profound is happening. Not just political change, but a historical transformation that philosophy must address. His philosophy has always emphasized historicity. Dasein isn't an eternal essence, but exists historically, shaped by the particular moment it inhabits. Different epochs understand being differently. Ancient Greeks experienced being as presence, things showing themselves. Medieval Christianity understood being through creation, everything existing by God's will. Modern philosophy reduced being to objectivity, things standing before a representing subject. Each epoch has its own way of unconcealing being, and the modern epoch, Heidegger thinks, has reached a crisis. Technology isn't just tools, it's a way of understanding everything as resource, as standing reserve, available for use. Nature becomes raw material, animals become livestock, humans become human resources. Everything gets reduced to its utility, its calculable value. Being itself gets forgotten in the frenzy of production and consumption. Heidegger sees Germany in 1930 caught between American capitalism and Soviet communism. Both, he thinks, are expressions of the same technological understanding of being. Both reduce everything to material for manipulation. He begins thinking that Germany might offer a third path, a retrieval of Greek beginnings, a new relationship to being that isn't technological domination. This thinking will lead him somewhere unforgivable. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Reichstag burns. Emergency decrees suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act grants Hitler dictatorial powers. Democracy collapses with startling speed. Universities, like every German institution, face pressure to align with the new order. Faculty members who are Jewish or politically suspect are dismissed. Student organizations demand ideological purity. The Nazi Student League organizes book burnings. Freiburg is not immune. The university rector, a liberal named Wilhelm von Müllendorf, resists Nazi interference, but the pressure is overwhelming. He resigns in April. The faculty needs to elect a replacement quickly before the regime imposes one. Several professors approach Heidegger. "You must stand for rector," they say. "If we don't choose someone ourselves, they'll send us a party functionary with no understanding of scholarship. You can protect the university's autonomy." Heidegger hesitates, but not for long. On April 21, 1933, Martin Heidegger is elected rector of the University of Freiburg. He receives overwhelming faculty support. Many colleagues believe he'll be a bulwark against political interference. They're catastrophically wrong. 10 days later, May 1st, Heidegger joins the Nazi Party. He doesn't join quietly or reluctantly. He embraces it. He wears the party badge. He gives the Hitler salute. He begins signing letters. The man who spent his career thinking about authenticity, about facing one's own most possibilities, about taking responsibility for one's existence, chooses this. On May 27th, he delivers his inaugural address as rector. The hall is decorated with swastikas. SA members in brown shirts stand at attention. Nazi officials fill the front rows. The speech, titled "The Self-Assertion of the German University," is not a defense of academic freedom. It's a call for total transformation. The German university, Heidegger declares, must assert itself, not against the regime, but through alignment with it. The three bonds that constitute the university are labour service, military service, and knowledge service. Students must learn through physical labour alongside workers and peasants. They must train for military duty, and their pursuit of knowledge must serve the destiny of the German people. Philosophy is not abstract contemplation. It's questioning that exposes a people to the imperatives of their historical situation. The speech invokes the Greeks, always the Greeks, but now Greek philosophy is yoked to German destiny. The beginning that was Greece must be retrieved and brought to its fulfillment in Germany. The university's freedom isn't freedom from the state. It's freedom for the spiritual mission of the German people, freedom to serve their historical struggle. He quotes Plato's Republic, that line about philosopher kings, but he twists it. The leaders must be led by the inexorability of that spiritual mission that forces the destiny of the German people into the stamp of their history. Philosophy becomes destiny. Destiny becomes the Führer principle. Many in the audience are enthusiastic. Some are troubled but say nothing. A few are horrified. Husserl, Heidegger's mentor, now 74 years old and Jewish, listens in disbelief. The dedication in being and time had read to Edmund Husserl in respect and friendship. That friendship is about to shatter. Heidegger throws himself into his rectorship with shocking energy. He doesn't merely administer, he attempts to revolutionize. He proposes restructuring the entire university around Nazi principles. He pushes for the dismissal of Jewish faculty members and those deemed politically unreliable. He encourages students to inform on professors whose teaching lacks ideological commitment. When colleagues resist, he accuses them of clinging to outmoded liberal individualism. The old idea of Bildung, of cultivating individual personality through classical learning, must be swept away. The university serves the folk, the people, as a historical political unity. He organises labour camps where students and faculty perform manual work together, breaking down class distinctions, he claims. Though it's really about indoctrination. He delivers speeches to student groups. The language is intoxicating, mixing philosophy with political fervour. Being and time and destiny, and the German people, and the Führer who embodies their historical will. There's a terrifying moment in his lecture notes from this period. He's discussing a fragment from Heraclitus. War is the father of all things. Heidegger interprets this philosophically, but then adds something chilling. If an enemy cannot be found, he suggests, one must be invented. Once identified, this enemy must be opposed totally, must face annihilation. Philosophy as struggle. Struggle as the essence of beings. It's not merely metaphorical. He means it politically. The enemy in 1933 is obvious. Jews, Marxists, liberals, anyone who stands outside the racial community. Heidegger isn't just accommodating the regime. He's providing philosophical justification for its violence. His colleagues are stunned. Some resign in protest. Others try to work around him. Karl Jaspers, his friend since the 1920s, watches with mounting horror from Heidelberg. Their correspondence grows strained. Jaspers' wife is Jewish. Heidegger knows this but says nothing that matters. The most painful betrayal involves Husserl. Under the new racial laws, Jewish professors are dismissed from their positions. Husserl, though retired, is stripped of his emeritus status. He's banned from using the university library. His life's work in phenomenology, built over decades, is repudiated by the institution that honoured him. Heidegger, as rector, does nothing to stop it. Worse, when Being and Time is reprinted in 1933, he removes the dedication to Husserl, the respect and friendship erased. The man who taught him phenomenology, who championed his career, who secured his professorship, is abandoned. Husserl writes in private notes, "For me, personally, the fact that he could be so completely unfree, indeed narrow, in his judgment of people, was always a puzzle." But Heidegger isn't conflicted. He believes something momentous is happening. Germany is awakening to its spiritual mission. The age of liberal democracy and technological calcification can be overcome. A new beginning is possible if Germans embrace their destiny, their rootedness in blood and soil, their connection to the Greek origin of Western thought. He's not simply opportunistic. That would be easier to understand. He genuinely believes the Nazi revolution can bring about a transformation of being itself, a retrieval of authentic dwelling that modernity has forgotten. Philosophy and politics have fused in his mind into something dangerous. His enthusiasm isn't universally shared within the party. Some Nazi officials find him useful, a prestigious intellectual who legitimizes the movement. Others think he's ridiculous, too abstract, too philosophical. Alfred Rosenberg, the party's chief ideologist, views Heidegger as a competitor and works to marginalize him. The regime wants simple slogans, not ontological meditations. They want racial science, not phenomenology. Heidegger's attempts to position himself as the philosopher of National Socialism are met with indifference or mockery by party leaders who prefer cruder thinkers. By early 1934, Heidegger's rectorship is failing. His radical proposals are blocked. Faculty resistance stiffens. The party doesn't trust him fully, and some officials actively oppose him. His attempt to merge philosophy with political leadership collapses under its own contradictions. In April 1934, he resigns as rector. The official reason is administrative burnout. The real reason is more complex. He's frustrated that the movement isn't philosophical enough, that it's become bureaucratic and vulgar. He withdraws from active party participation, though he remains a member until 1945. He never renounces his membership. He never publicly admits error. What happens next is peculiar. Heidegger retreats from politics into what he'll later call the turn in his thinking. He stops trying to change the world directly and begins something different. He starts thinking about the history of being, about how Western metaphysics went wrong, about technology as destiny rather than tool. The later Heidegger is less voluntarist, less focused on resolute action. He emphasizes receptivity, listening, waiting. He writes about dwelling and building, about poetry and art, about the danger of technological enframing. He reads Hölderlin's poetry intensely, finding in it a response to modernity's spiritual emptiness. Some interpret this as Heidegger distancing himself from Nazism. Others see it as deepening his commitment in a different register. The question of being and the question of Germany remain intertwined in his thinking. He never separates them cleanly. Throughout the war years, he continues teaching at Freiburg, but publishes little. His lectures grow increasingly cryptic, focused on Nietzsche, on the history of metaphysics, on the event of appropriation that might rescue Western thought from nihilism. Students who attend describe a man who seems simultaneously present and absent, speaking from some distance they can't traverse. He never speaks publicly against the regime. He never protects his Jewish students or colleagues. He never acknowledges the reality of what's happening around him. When Hannah Arendt flees Germany in 1933, he writes her no letters of support. Their affair ended in 1928, but his silence now is its own statement. The question that will haunt his reputation forever is simple and impossible. How deeply did Heidegger's philosophy enable his politics? Was his embrace of Nazism a terrible accident, a personal failing separate from his thought? Or was it inherent in the framework itself? Defenders argue that Being and Time contains nothing inherently fascist. Its analysis of Dasein, of care and temporality, of being toward death, these are philosophical insights that transcend political application. Heidegger's politics were a catastrophic mistake, but the philosophy remains valid. Critics counter that the structure of his thought made this mistake likely. The emphasis on authenticity versus inauthentic mass existence, the elevation of destiny and heritage, the romanticization of rootedness and homeland, the contempt for liberal democracy and rational discourse, the vocabulary of struggle and decision. All of this created conceptual space for fascism to enter, and there's the question of his silence after the war, his refusal to confront what happened, to acknowledge the Holocaust, to apologize meaningfully to those he betrayed. That silence will stain everything he writes, but we're not there yet. The war continues, and Heidegger, like everyone in Germany, is waiting to see how history will resolve itself. The Germany of 1945 is unrecognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years has collapsed in 12. And in Freiburg, Martin Heidegger waits to see what will happen to him. The French occupy the region. They're not gentle with prominent Nazis. Heidegger's party membership since 1933 is documented. His rectoral address is on record. His enthusiasm for the movement, however brief, cannot be denied. The question is what price he'll pay. In December 1946, the French military government establishes a Denazification commission. Heidegger is summoned to appear. He's asked to explain his actions, his beliefs, his role in legitimizing the regime. His responses are careful, calculated, and fundamentally evasive. He claims he joined the party to prevent worse outcomes. He insists his rectorship was an attempt to protect the university from party interference. He describes himself as naive about politics, misled by idealism, ultimately disappointed by the movement's vulgarity. He does not apologize. He does not acknowledge the Holocaust. He does not express horror at what happened. His defense is technical, focused on his own intentions rather than their consequences. The commission is not impressed. In January 1946, he's prohibited from teaching. The ban will last until 1951. He's stripped of his emeritus status, his pension reduced. It's punishment, but not devastation. Many of his colleagues suffer worse. What follows is what Heidegger will later call his time in the wilderness. Unable to teach, he retreats to his mountain hut in Tottenauberg, the simple dwelling in the Black Forest, where he spent summers for years. It's primitive. No electricity, no running water, just silence and the surrounding forest. He writes, constantly, obsessively. The work from this period marks a radical shift in his thinking. He's moving away from the existential analytics of being and time towards something stranger and harder to categorize. He develops what becomes known as the history of being. It's a narrative about how Western metaphysics went wrong from its Greek beginnings, how it culminated in modern technology, and how a different relationship to being might be possible. The vocabulary changes. He writes about the fourfold, earth and sky, mortals and divinities. He meditates on dwelling and building, on poetry and language. He reads Hölderlin's hymns as philosophical texts, finding in them hints of what's been forgotten. This later philosophy is opaque, mystical, deliberately anti-systematic. Where being and time was rigorous and structured, The later works resist analysis. They circle around their subjects, approaching truth obliquely through etymology, through meditation on individual words. Critics call it obscurantism. Defenders see profundity. Either way, it's a different Heidegger. Some interpret this shift as genuine philosophical evolution. Others suspect it's camouflage, a way to distance himself from his political past without actually confronting it. The timing is convenient. As soon as his Nazi involvement becomes liability, his thought turns toward receptivity and letting be, rather than resoluteness and decision. But the new direction has its own coherence. Heidegger argues that modern technology isn't just tools we use, but a way of revealing the world that reduces everything to standing reserve, resources available for exploitation. This enframing, as he calls it, is the culmination of Western metaphysics, its hidden trajectory finally visible, and this technological worldview is totalizing. It admits no outside, no alternative relationship to beings. We're trapped within it, even as it threatens to destroy what makes human existence meaningful. The only hope, he suggests, is a different kind of thinking. Not the calculative rationality of science and technology, but meditative thinking that lets things be, that listens rather than dominates. This requires patience, receptivity, and ability to dwell in uncertainty. It's almost religious language, but emptied of traditional theology. He's describing something like secular mysticism, a stance toward being that modern rationality has foreclosed. He publishes these ideas slowly, cautiously. Letter on Humanism in 1947 responds to Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, rejecting its voluntarism while reclaiming his own earlier work. The question concerning technology appears in 1954, his most sustained analysis of modernity's danger. Poetry, language, thought collects essays on art and dwelling. The work finds an audience, particularly among younger intellectuals, disillusioned with both capitalism and Soviet communism, seeking alternatives to technological rationality. But his silence about the war continues. In 1949, he delivers lectures on technology that mention the Holocaust exactly once in passing, comparing the mechanization of agriculture to the death camps. The comparison outrages his critics. How can he equate industrial farming with genocide? How can he reduce mass murder to an example of technological enframing? His defenders claim he's being misread, that he's pointing to a deeper pattern. But the moral obtuseness is breathtaking. He never apologizes to Husserl's family. Edmund Husserl died in 1938, ostracized and isolated, his Jewish heritage making him persona non grata at the university where he taught for decades. Heidegger, who owed his career to Husserl, who dedicated being and time to him, did nothing to help. After the war, he writes Husserl's widow once, a brief note expressing regret about how things went. She does not respond. Hannah Arendt re-establishes contact in 1950. She visits him in Freiburg, and whatever transpires between them remains private. She will later defend aspects of his philosophy while condemning his politics, a delicate balancing act that satisfies no one. Their relationship resumes in some form, correspondence continuing until Heidegger's death. It's complicated. She cannot forgive him entirely, but cannot abandon him either. The man who introduced her to philosophy remains bound to her intellectually, even as she recognizes his moral failure. In 1951, the teaching ban is lifted. Heidegger returns to the university, but not to his chair. He gives seminars, attracts students, but he's no longer the dominating presence he once was. The post-war generation views him with suspicion. Some attend his lectures out of curiosity, wanting to see the controversial figure whose name everyone knows. Others stay away, refusing to legitimize a Nazi philosopher. His reputation abroad grows inversely to his situation in Germany. French intellectuals, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty engage seriously with his work. The existentialist movement claims him as forefather despite his protests. In America, his ideas percolate through literary criticism and theology. Herbert Marcuse, his former student now in California, tries to get him to make a clear statement about the Holocaust. Heidegger refuses. The correspondence ends badly. What's emerging is a pattern. Heidegger will discuss his philosophy endlessly. He'll explain, clarify, respond to criticisms of his thought. But about his Nazi involvement, he remains silent. When pressed, he deflects. He claims he's been misunderstood, that his critics have political motivations, that true thinking requires moving beyond such concerns. It's a strategy of evasion that will define his post-war reputation. In 1966, Der Spiegel interviews him with the understanding that it won't be published until after his death. It's his chance to explain himself, to address the questions that haunt him. He uses it to defend his actions, to minimize his involvement, to claim that only a God can save us now from technology's dominion. He does not reckon with what he enabled. He does not acknowledge the victims. Even posthumously, he protects himself. The interview reveals something important. Heidegger believes he was right about the spiritual crisis of the West, right about technology's danger, right about the need for new thinking. His only error was thinking Nazism might be the answer. But that error, in his view, doesn't invalidate the diagnosis. The problem he identified remains, and his philosophy, stripped of its political application, still offers insights worth preserving. This is the core of his post-war self-understanding. He separates his thought from its historical entanglement, treating his Nazi involvement as regrettable, but ultimately incidental. The philosophy transcends the biography. Critics find this intellectually dishonest. How can you separate ideas from their context when the context was genocide? How can you claim your thinking about authenticity and destiny had nothing to do with your embrace of totalitarian politics? But Heidegger persists. He continues writing, continues teaching, continues developing his late philosophy. His students include some who will become major thinkers themselves. Hans-Georg Gadamer, who develops philosophical hermeneutics. Jacques Derrida, who'll create deconstruction, partly by working through Heidegger. Michel Foucault, whose analysis of power and knowledge owes debts he sometimes acknowledges. The influence spreads despite the controversy, perhaps because of it. What's happening is a strange bifurcation. In philosophy departments, Heidegger remains essential, his questions about being and technology inescapable. In wider culture, he's the Nazi philosopher, the cautionary tale about intellectuals and totalitarianism. Both assessments contain truth. Neither captures the full complexity. He's simultaneously one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century and someone whose political choices discredit everything he wrote. The contradiction cannot be resolved. It must be held in tension. By the 1960s, he's elderly, but still working. The mountain hut in Totnoberg becomes pilgrimage site for students and admirers. They hike up to meet the master, to discuss being and language in that primitive dwelling. He's crafted an image, the solitary thinker, withdrawn from modernity, dwelling poetically in the Black Forest. It's performative, but also genuine. He really does prefer this isolation to academic politics. His health declines slowly. He continues writing, but publishes less. Much of his later work will appear only posthumously, edited by his son and various disciples. The Gesamtausgabe, his collected works, will eventually run to over 100 volumes. It's an enormous corpus, much of it lecture courses and seminars, revealing the development of his thought across decades. In 1976, his 87th year, he's still writing, still thinking about being, about language, about the possibility of a new beginning for Western thought. He never stops. Even when his body fails, His mind continues working through the questions that have occupied him since he first read Brentano as a teenager in Freiburg. What remains unsettled is the central question. Was Heidegger's philosophy inherently fascist, or was his politics a terrible mistake separate from his genuine philosophical contributions? The debate continues, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Every generation of scholars must wrestle with it anew. Some questions have answers that arrive decades too late. In May 1976, Martin Heidegger sits with journalist William Richardson discussing language and being. He's 86 years old. His body has betrayed him, but his mind remains sharp, working through problems that have occupied him since he first read Aristotle as a teenager. He knows these might be his last conversations about philosophy. Richardson asks about technology again, about modernity's direction. Heidegger's answer circles back to themes he's developed over decades. Technology isn't just machines or tools, it's a way of seeing the world, of relating to everything that exists. Modern humanity treats nature as standing reserve, as resources waiting to be exploited. Forests become timber, rivers become hydroelectric potential, even humans become human resources. This technological framing has spread everywhere. We can't escape it because we can't see it. It's become our entire framework for understanding reality. The danger isn't that machines will destroy us. The danger is that we'll stop being able to think outside technological categories. We'll forget other ways of being exist. What's the alternative? Heidegger doesn't offer solutions, he never has. His role, as he sees it, is diagnostic. He points toward the problem's depth. He suggests that genuine thinking might prepare us for what comes next, but he can't prescribe what that thinking should produce. Only a God can save us now, he tells another interviewer. It's his most famous late statement, endlessly debated and interpreted. Does he mean it literally? Is he calling for religious renewal? Or is this metaphorical language pointing towards something beyond human control? The phrase reveals his conviction that technological civilization has reached a point where human effort alone cannot redirect its course. Something fundamental must shift. Some transformation we cannot engineer or plan. His health deteriorates through 1975 and into 1976. The mountain hut in Todtnauberg, once a place of vigorous work and long walks, becomes harder to reach. His body won't cooperate. Students still visit, but the conversations grow shorter. He tires easily. The writing continues, though. Even now, approaching the end, his mind works through language, through etymology, through the careful unpacking of words. He's working on texts about language itself, about poetry, about the relationship between thinking and speaking. These late writings are fragmented, exploratory. They don't build systematic arguments. They circle their subjects, approaching from different angles, trying to let things show themselves rather than forcing them into conceptual frameworks. Some readers find them profound, others find them mystical to the point of meaninglessness. Both responses have merit. Heidegger has moved far from the rigorous phenomenological method of being and time. The late work operates differently, through suggestion and evocation rather than argument. Whether this represents philosophical progress or intellectual decline depends on who you ask. His family remains protective. Elfried manages visitors, controls access, preserves his routine. Their marriage has lasted over 50 years, through wartime chaos, post-war disgrace, and decades of controversy. She's near. Via wavered in her support or her management of his reputation. After his death, she'll continue this work, overseeing publication of his collected works. The black notebooks won't appear until long after both are gone. His sons have their own complicated relationships with their father's legacy. Jörg, the elder, becomes a trained engineer. Hermann studies philosophy. Both will be involved in managing the vast posthumous publication project. They inherit not just manuscripts, but questions. How do you honor a father whose work is important, but whose politics were abhorrent? How do you separate the man from the ideas? They choose to publish everything, including the damaging material. Let the evidence speak for itself. Let scholars judge. It's a defensible position, though it guarantees continued controversy. By late spring 1976, Heidegger's condition is clearly terminal. He's confined to bed more often than not. The doctors can do little. His organs are simply wearing out. There's no dramatic illness, just systemic decline. The body that carried him through 87 years is giving up. He remains lucid until near the end. Friends who visit in these final weeks report that he still wants to discuss philosophy. He asks about their work, their students, the state of thinking in Germany and beyond. He's interested in what will come after him, though he expresses little optimism. The technological worldview he diagnosed decades ago has only intensified. Computers are beginning to change society in ways he didn't live to see. The internet, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, all the transformations that will reshape human existence in the decades after his death. These would have confirmed his darkest warnings about technology's trajectory. He might have found vindication in them, or perhaps horror that his warnings went unheeded. On May 26, 1976, Martin Heidegger dies in Freiburg. The man who began in a medieval Catholic town, who trained for priesthood and turned to philosophy, who revolutionized continental thought and disgraced himself through political collaboration, reaches his end. He's buried in Meeskirch, the small Black Forest town where he was born. The funeral is quiet, attended by family and a few close associates. No grand academic ceremony, no public memorial at the university. His status remains too controversial for official recognition. The obituaries that appear in newspapers across Germany and beyond wrestle with the same question that has dogged him for decades. How do you sum up this life? Which takes precedence, the philosophy or the politics? The Times of London calls him one of the century's most important and most controversial philosophers. Le Monde acknowledges his influence while noting his Nazi past. German papers are more conflicted, still working through the trauma of their national history. The philosophical community begins immediate reassessment. Symposia are organised. Special journal issues appear. Students and critics alike start working through the implications of a body of work that is now complete. No more clarifications will come from the author himself. Everything he wrote must stand on its own. Some scholars argue that Heidegger's Nazi involvement was central to his philosophy, that his thinking about authenticity and destiny and people and homeland was always proto-fascist. The political error wasn't a mistake, but the logical conclusion of his ideas. Others maintain that his philosophical breakthroughs remain valid despite his personal and political failures. Being and Time's analysis of human existence doesn't require Nazi politics. The later work on technology and modernity offers insights independent of his 1930s actions. This debate intensifies rather than resolves after his death. Each generation of scholars examines the question anew, often reaching different conclusions based on which texts they emphasize and which biographical details they find most significant. His influence on subsequent philosophy is undeniable, regardless of political judgment. Existentialism as a movement draws heavily on his analysis of human existence. Sartre's being and nothingness, despite fundamental disagreements with Heidegger, is unthinkable without being and time as its predecessor. Camus' absurdism responds to questions Heidegger raised about meaning and world. Hermeneutics, the philosophy of interpretation, develops through Hans-Georg Gadamer's elaboration of Heideggerian insights. Gadamer's truth and method transforms Heidegger's analysis of understanding into a comprehensive approach to human sciences. Deconstruction emerges from Jacques Derrida's careful reading and critique of Heidegger. Derrida sees both the power and the limitations of Heideggerian thinking, developing a method that pushes beyond it while remaining deeply indebted to it. Postmodernism, more broadly, carries Heideggerian DNA. The suspicion of grand narratives, the attention to language's constitutive role, the critique of technological rationality, all these themes that define postmodern thought have roots in Heidegger's work. Environmental philosophy discovers resources in his critique of technology. His analysis of how modernity treats nature as standing reserve influences deep ecology and other movements questioning anthropocentric worldviews. Theologians continue engaging with his thought despite his break from Catholicism. His questions about being and nothing, about finitude and transcendence, about language's limits, all these resonate with religious thinkers trying to articulate faith in a post-metaphysical age. Even analytic philosophy, which generally rejected continental approaches, eventually begins limited engagement with Heidegger. His philosophy of language, his critique of Cartesian assumptions, his phenomenological method, all find careful readers among philosophers who would have dismissed him entirely in earlier decades. The collected works begin appearing in the years after his death. The Gesamtausgabe eventually runs to over 100 volumes. It's an extraordinary corpus, revealing the scope of his teaching and thinking. Lecture courses from the 1920s show his method developing. Seminars from the 1950s and 60s reveal his late preoccupations. Unpublished manuscripts offer new material for interpretation. But it's the Black Notebooks, published in 2014, that reignite controversy most dramatically. These private philosophical journals, written between 1931 and the early 1970s, contain passages that many scholars find genuinely anti-Semitic. Not just Nazi-era nationalism, but explicit references to world Judaism as metaphysical threat. The defenders who argued that Heidegger's philosophy was separable from his politics face harder questions. If his private notebooks weave anti-Semitic themes into his philosophical reflections, can the separation be maintained? The debate continues. Probably it will never end. Heidegger gave us questions too profound to ignore and actions too terrible to forgive. The tension between these facts defines his legacy. Universities still teach being and time in philosophy programs worldwide. Students struggle through its difficult prose, wrestle with its strange terminology, emerge changed by encountering a radically different way of thinking about existence. They also learn about his Nazi rectorship, his failure to denounce the regime, his post-war silence about victims. The question each student must answer: can you learn from this thinker while condemning his actions? Most find ways to hold both truths simultaneously. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. Philosophy has no shortage of brilliant people with terrible politics. Heidegger is simply the most extreme case. What remains most powerful in his work is the question of being itself. Western philosophy from Plato onward had forgotten to ask what it means for anything to exist at all. It took existence for granted, focused on categorizing beings without examining being. Heidegger forced the question back to center. Even if his specific answers fail, even if his method proves limited, even if his politics contaminate his conclusions, the question he asked remains essential. What does it mean to be? That question outlives its questioner. The question sits in the middle of every philosophy classroom, every scholarly conference, every book that mentions his name. How do we think about Heidegger now? Some argue for complete separation. The philosophy stands apart from the philosopher. Being and Time asks genuine questions about existence that remain valid regardless of who wrote them. You don't reject Pythagorean theorem because you dislike Pythagoras. Mathematical truth transcends biography. Maybe philosophical truth works the same way. Others find this position untenable. Philosophy isn't mathematics. It deals with how we should live, what matters, how we understand ourselves and others. When a philosopher's life contradicts his philosophy so dramatically, that contradiction becomes philosophically significant. Heidegger wrote about authenticity while living inauthentically. He analysed being with others while supporting a regime that denied the humanity of millions. The gap between thought and action reveals something about the thought itself. Then there's the question of whether his philosophy actively enabled his politics. Did the concepts themselves contain seeds of what followed? Some scholars trace connections. The emphasis on rootedness, on belonging to soil and tradition, the critique of cosmopolitanism, the romantic nationalism threaded through his language about the German people's special destiny, the contempt for rationalist universalism that characterized Enlightenment thought. Maybe it wasn't coincidence that this particular thinker made those particular choices, but others counter that similar ideas appear in philosophers who became anti-fascists. Rootedness and belonging don't automatically lead to fascism. Critique of technology doesn't require Nazi Party membership. Heidegger's choices were his own, not inevitable consequences of his concepts. The debate never settles because the evidence pulls both ways. His philosophy contains resources for conservative nationalism and for radical openness. His concepts can be deployed toward exclusion or inclusion. Language about authenticity and rootedness bends in multiple directions depending on who's doing the bending. What we know with certainty is that Heidegger himself bent them toward darkness. The post-war period revealed another dimension of his failure. When Germany confronted what had happened, when survivors testified and documentation emerged, and the full scope of atrocity became undeniable, Heidegger remained silent about the victims. He spoke of Germany's suffering. He never spoke of Germany's crimes. In 1949, he gave a lecture series called The Danger, where he mentioned the Holocaust exactly once. He grouped it with mechanized agriculture as examples of technological thinking, the extermination camps and industrial farming, equivalent symptoms of modernity's problem with being. That equation horrified many who heard it. 6 million dead reduced to illustration for a philosophical point about technology. He never apologized, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the human cost of the regime he'd supported. His silence wasn't passive, it was active refusal to confront what he'd been part of. Some former students never forgave this. Hannah Arendt, who'd loved him, who'd tried to defend aspects of his thought, found his post-war position morally intolerable. She wrote about the banality of evil partly to understand how ordinary people committed extraordinary crimes. The question applied to her former teacher. Karl Lowith, another Jewish student who'd fled Germany, met Heidegger in Rome in 1936. Heidegger wore his Nazi Party pin throughout their conversation. Lowith asked directly whether his philosophy connected to his political commitment. Heidegger confirmed it did. The philosophy and the politics formed a unity in his mind. That conversation, when it became public decades later, strengthened the case that separation was impossible. Heidegger himself rejected the separation his defenders wanted to maintain. Yet the philosophy continued spreading. Students who condemned the man still found value in the concepts. Sartre built existentialism partly from Heideggerian materials. Derrida developed deconstruction through wrestling with Heidegger's language philosophy. Gadamer extended the hermeneutic tradition that Heidegger had shaped. They transformed what they inherited. They took tools and used them for different purposes. They showed that ideas escape their origins, become available for projects their creator never imagined. This is what makes intellectual history so complicated. Bad people can ask good questions. Terrible politics can coexist with genuine philosophical insight. The human capacity for compartmentalization extends even to brilliant minds, or maybe especially to brilliant minds. Maybe the ability to think abstractly about being creates dangerous distance from concrete human beings. Maybe philosophical brilliance and moral wisdom don't correlate the way we'd like to believe. Heidegger certainly demonstrated that disconnect. He could analyse Dasein's care structure with extraordinary subtlety, while showing no care for actual people suffering under the regime he supported. He could write about being toward death, while remaining indifferent to millions murdered. The disconnect wasn't incidental, it was structural. His philosophy, for all its apparent concern with concrete existence, actually moved away from the ethical demands of facing other people. Emanuel Levinas, who attended Heidegger's lectures before fleeing Nazi Germany, built his entire philosophy around this critique. For Levinas, ethics begins with the face of the other person, with the absolute demand that face makes on us. Heidegger's philosophy, focused on Dasein's solitary relationship to being, evaded that demand. Maybe that evasion made his political choices easier. When philosophy brackets ethics, when the question of being becomes more important than the question of how we treat each other, dangerous possibilities open. This is what students grapple with when they encounter his work now. They're not just learning difficult concepts, they're inheriting a moral problem. How do you engage seriously with thought that emerged from such darkness? Different disciplines answer differently. Literary theorists often bracket the biographical entirely, focusing on how Heideggerian concepts illuminate texts. Philosophers tend to engage the problem more directly, arguing about whether and how to separate thinker from thought. Historians use his case to understand intellectual collaboration with totalitarianism. None of these approaches fully resolves the tension, because the tension is irresolvable. We're left holding contradictions, profound insights and moral catastrophe, philosophical brilliance and political blindness, work that opened new paths and a life that supported murderous closure. The response can't be simple rejection. Too much of contemporary thought bears his influence. Rejecting Heidegger entirely would require rejecting large portions of phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, deconstruction, and postmodern theory. The genealogy is too entangled. But the response can't be simple acceptance either. Reading Heidegger now requires acknowledging what he supported, how he failed, what his silence cost. It requires reading against him, even while learning from him. This double movement, engagement and critique simultaneously, characterizes how serious scholarship approaches his legacy. You can study his analysis of anxiety without endorsing his politics. You can find his critique of technology valuable while condemning his technological comparison of Holocaust to agriculture. You can learn from his questions while rejecting his answers. What you can't do is pretend the problem doesn't exist. Can't treat him like any other philosopher whose biography matters less than concepts. The gap between his thought and his choices became part of what his work means. Future generations will keep arguing about this. New evidence will emerge from archives. Different historical contexts will generate fresh interpretations. The controversy won't end because the questions it raises are permanent questions about philosophy's relationship to ethics, thought's relationship to action. Heidegger wanted to be remembered for asking the question of being. He'll be remembered for that and for his failure to ask the prior question. The question about how we should live with other human beings. The question about what we owe each other. The question his philosophy systematically evaded and his life catastrophically answered. That evasion and that answer now form inseparable parts of how we read what he wrote. Every page of Being and Time carries this shadow. Every analysis of Dasein's existence asks silently about the existence of those he refused to acknowledge. Every discussion of authenticity confronts his profound inauthenticity. The philosophical corpus remains: 100 volumes of collected works, thousands of pages of lectures, seminars, private notes, an extraordinary record of one mind's attempt to think being. But we read it now, knowing what that mind refused to think about. The actual being suffering while he philosophized. the human cost of the regime he supported, the victims his post-war silence abandoned again. This isn't just about one philosopher's moral failure. It's about what happens when brilliant minds, convinced of their own insight, lose sight of elementary human decency. The Heidegger case forces a question that extends far beyond philosophy seminars. How much does it matter who said something when evaluating whether it's true? The instinctive answer seems obvious. Truth is truth, regardless of source. Mathematical theorems don't become false because their discoverers were terrible people. Scientific discoveries retain validity independent of the scientist's character. But philosophy isn't mathematics. Philosophical claims about human existence, about how we should live, about what matters, these aren't separable from the life of the person making them. When someone proposes a theory of authentic existence while living inauthentically, that's not just biographical trivia, it's evidence against the theory. Heidegger wrote extensively about authenticity, about facing one's own mortality, about taking responsibility for one's choices. He described inauthentic existence as fleeing into comfortable illusions, letting others dictate how you think and act. The ironic distance between these descriptions and his actual choices during the Nazi period is almost unbearable. The philosopher of authenticity chose to join, support, and remain silent about one of history's most destructive movements. Some defenders argue his philosophy and his politics should be kept separate, that being and time's analysis of time and existence stands independent of later political choices. This separation becomes harder to maintain as you read deeper. The concepts that seemed purely ontological start revealing connections to his political commitments. The emphasis on rootedness in soil and tradition, the critique of modern technology's levelling effects, the concern with authenticity versus mass conformity, these weren't neutral philosophical observations. They aligned with and perhaps prepared the way for his political turn. The Black Notebooks make this connection explicit. Published posthumously against his family's initial wishes, these private journals reveal anti-Semitic remarks woven directly into philosophical reflections. Not casual prejudices kept separate from serious thought, but prejudices integrated into the thinking itself. World Judaism appears as a metaphysical problem, not just a political opinion. This isn't a philosopher who happened to have ugly personal views. It's a philosopher whose ugly views shaped his philosophical categories. Reading Heidegger now requires constant vigilance. You can't just absorb the concepts without asking where they lead. His critique of modern technology seems prescient until you remember he compared industrial agriculture to the Holocaust. His analysis of homelessness and rootlessness resonates until you recognize the Völkisch nationalism underlying it. Every insight carries potential poison, yet completely rejecting his work creates different problems. Too much of contemporary thought traces back through Heidegger. Existentialism, hermeneutics, deconstruction, postmodern theory, all bear his influence. Dismissing him entirely means cutting off huge branches of 20th century philosophy. You'd lose Sartre's development of freedom and responsibility, Gadamer's hermeneutic philosophy, Derrida's deconstruction, Levinas's ethics of the other. All these thinkers worked through and against Heidegger. The solution, such as it is, involves reading critically and historically, recognizing that profound insights can coexist with terrible blindness, understanding that brilliant analysis of one aspect of existence doesn't guarantee wisdom about others, acknowledging that philosophical genius offers no protection against moral catastrophe. His students who were Jewish faced impossible situations. Hannah Arendt returned to Germany after the war and met with Heidegger again, a decision many found incomprehensible. She distinguished between the person who had betrayed her and the thinker whose work had opened her intellectual eyes. Whether this distinction holds remains debated. Herbert Marcuse, another Jewish student, wrote to Heidegger demanding he publicly denounce the Nazi crimes. Heidegger's response was evasive, comparing Nazi atrocities to Soviet actions and American treatment of Native Americans. This deflection, this refusal to specifically acknowledge and condemn what he'd supported, characterized his post-war stance. Karl Lewith, forced to flee Germany, wrote later that Heidegger's philosophy and his Nazism were connected at a deep level, that the emphasis on fate, destiny, and historical mission prepared the ground for political commitment to a movement promising German renewal. Lewith knew Heidegger personally, understood his thought intimately, and concluded that the philosophy itself contained tendencies toward the political choices. This interpretation remains contested. Other scholars argue Heidegger's core insights about being, time, and existence can be separated from his disastrous political applications, that his analysis of thrownness, of finding ourselves already in situations we didn't choose, actually undermines nationalist ideology rather than supporting it, that his emphasis on mortality and finitude contradicts the grandiose historical narratives Nazism promoted. Both readings find textual support. Heidegger's work is dense, ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. This ambiguity itself becomes problematic. Philosophy that can be read both as profound critique of modern nihilism and as preparation for fascist commitment needs more clarity about its practical implications. The later Heidegger, after the war, shifted focus from human existence to being itself. The turn in his thought moved away from the existential analytics of being and time toward reflections on language, poetry, and technology. Some see this as deepening his original project. Others view it as retreat from the political disaster into increasingly obscure abstraction. His essays on technology from this period contain genuine insights. The concern that modern technical thinking reduces everything to standing reserve, to resources available for exploitation, captures something real about industrial society. But even here, his earlier associations haunt the text. When he writes about the danger of calculative thinking overwhelming meditative thought, it's hard not to hear echoes of earlier complaints about rootless cosmopolitanism. The question of whether to teach Heidegger divides philosophy departments. Some argue his importance to the tradition makes him unavoidable. You can't understand 20th century continental philosophy without engaging his work. Others contend that teaching him without extensive historical context risks normalizing his political choices, suggesting brilliant philosophy excuses moral failure. The compromise usually involves teaching him critically, including biographical context, discussing the political implications, reading him alongside critics like Levinas who directly challenged his ethics. This approach treats his work as important but dangerous, requiring careful handling. Whether this suffices remains uncertain. Students encountering Heidegger for the first time often experience whiplash. The philosophical concepts seem revolutionary, offering new ways to understand existence, time, and meaning. Then learning about his Nazi membership and post-war silence creates cognitive dissonance. How do you hold both together, the brilliant phenomenologist and the moral catastrophe? Some never resolve this tension. They abandon Heidegger entirely, deciding the contamination goes too deep. Others separate the work from the life, treating the philosophy as valuable despite the philosopher's failures. Most thoughtful readers end up somewhere between, engaging his ideas while maintaining critical distance, learning from insights while rejecting implications. What makes Heidegger's case particularly troubling is that he wasn't a scientist who happened to have ugly political views. He was a philosopher concerned explicitly with questions of existence, meaning, and how to live. His work claimed to offer fundamental insights into human being. When someone making such claims fails so profoundly in practice, it raises questions about the claims themselves. The The standard defense that you can appreciate Wagner's music while deploring his anti-Semitism doesn't quite work here. Musical composition and political ideology occupy different domains. But philosophy, about human existence and actual human choices, the connection seems more direct. If your philosophy of authentic existence allows you to authentically support genocide, something's wrong with your philosophy. Defenders sometimes invoke other examples. Frege's anti-Semitic diaries don't invalidate his contributions to logic. Kant's racist remarks don't undermine the categorical imperative. These comparisons reveal the problem's breadth rather than excusing Heidegger. Every case requires separate evaluation of how deeply personal failures connect to philosophical claims. With Heidegger, the connection runs deep. His philosophical emphasis on destiny, on historical mission, on the importance of a people's rootedness in tradition and soil, these themes fed directly into his political commitments. You can't cleanly separate the ontology from the ideology because the ontology helped generate the ideology. This doesn't mean every concept he developed is tainted. His analysis of time's three-dimensional structure, his account of understanding as interpretation, his critique of Cartesian dualism, these contributions retain value even if other aspects of his thought led him toward catastrophe. Philosophy rarely divides neatly into good and bad parts. It's more like a web where insights and errors interweave. The proper response involves neither wholesale acceptance nor total rejection. It requires reading with eyes open, taking what's valuable while rejecting what's dangerous, learning from mistakes as much as achievements. Heidegger's legacy includes both the philosophical innovations in being and time and the moral failures of his Nazi period. Both matter. Both require acknowledgement. Future scholarship will continue excavating his work, discovering new connections between his philosophy and his politics, finding both resources for critique and evidence of complicity. The conversation won't end because the questions he raises remain urgent. How do we think about being? How does technology shape existence? What constitutes authentic living? These questions don't disappear because he answered them poorly, but now they're asked in his shadow. Every discussion of authenticity, every analysis of modern technology's effects, every phenomenological investigation carries implicit reference to his work and his failure. Philosophy after Heidegger must be philosophy aware of philosophy's limits, conscious that brilliant analysis provides no ethical guarantee. The boy from Meßkirch who questioned the meaning of being ended up demonstrating that the question of being means nothing without the prior question of justice. That ontology without ethics is worse than incomplete. It's dangerous. That asking about the nature of existence while ignoring the existence of actual suffering humans is not profound philosophy, but profound failure. This is the final paradox of Heidegger's legacy. His greatest contribution might be showing what happens when philosophy forgets its human responsibilities, when abstract thought loses connection to concrete suffering, when the question of being overshadows the question of how we treat beings. Every page of his work now carries this lesson, not the lesson he intended to teach, but the one his life and choices demonstrated. That brilliance without moral clarity is not wisdom. That philosophical sophistication offers no protection against elementary failures of human decency. That the longest shadow is cast by those who see furthest but look in the wrong direction. Looking back at Heidegger's 87 years reveals a pattern that philosophy departments still struggle to address. A Catholic boy becomes a priest in training, abandons faith for phenomenology, revolutionizes how we think about existence, joins the Nazis, retreats into obscurity, and dies without ever truly reckoning with what he enabled. The arc doesn't resolve into comfortable conclusions. Stand in any philosophy seminar today and mention his name. Watch how the room divides. Some defend the concepts while condemning the man. Others argue the concepts themselves contain the seeds of what followed. A few suggest we should stop teaching him entirely, let his work fade into historical curiosity rather than living tradition. None of these positions fully satisfies because the problem Heidegger represents has no solution, only different ways of managing the discomforts. His question about being remains essential. Western philosophy really had forgotten to ask why there is something rather than nothing, had taken existence for granted while categorizing what exists. Forcing that question back to center was genuine achievement. The analysis of time in being and time, the recognition that human existence is fundamentally temporal, structured by past and future, rather than contained in present moments. This opened new paths for understanding consciousness and meaning. The critique of technology predicted much of what we're living through now. That sense that everything gets reduced to resource, that calculative thinking overwhelms other ways of relating to the world, that modern rationality creates a cage we can barely see from inside. Look at how we talk about optimizing human performance, monetizing attention, extracting value from every interaction. Heidegger identified this logic decades before it metastasized into current form. But these insights came from someone who supported industrial murder, who remained silent about victims, who never apologized, never acknowledged, never faced what he'd been part of. The philosophical brilliance and the moral catastrophe aren't separate stories that happen to intersect in one biography. They're entangled at the root. His emphasis on authenticity, on owning your choices and facing your mortality, sounds profound until you realize he never applied it to his own worst decisions. The call to resist mass conformity and think for yourself came from someone who conformed to genocidal ideology. The concern with rootedness and belonging fed directly into blood and soil nationalism. You can't strip these connections away and preserve only the pure philosophy, because there is no pure philosophy here. What remains is wreckage we're still sorting through. Concepts that illuminate and mislead simultaneously. Questions that matter asked by someone who ignored more important questions. A body of work so influential it can't be discarded, but so contaminated it can't be embraced without reservation. Every generation rediscovers this problem. Students encounter being and time, feel their minds expanding, experience the thrill of seeing familiar things become strange and significant. Then they learn about 1933, about the rectoral address in a hall full of swastikas, about the post-war silence, about the private notebooks where anti-Semitism weaves into philosophical reflection. The cognitive dissonance forces a choice about how to proceed. Some choose separation, treating the philosophy as independent from the philosopher's failures. They argue mathematics doesn't care about mathematicians' politics, and neither should ontology, but existence isn't geometry. Claims about how humans should live aren't separable from how the claimant lived. The gap between Heidegger's philosophy of authenticity and his inauthentic choices isn't just biographical irony, it's philosophical evidence. Others choose rejection, deciding the contamination runs too deep for salvage. If your philosophy of being in the world allowed you to be in the world of National Socialism, the philosophy failed its own test. If your analysis of care and responsibility didn't generate actual care or responsibility for suffering humans, something essential was missing from the analysis. Most scholars end up practicing what you might call critical engagement, reading him carefully while reading against him simultaneously, learning from insights while remaining alert to implications, using his concepts while subjecting them to ethical scrutiny he never applied. This approach acknowledges both his importance to the tradition and his catastrophic failures, holding the contradiction without resolving it. The unresolved contradiction is the point. Heidegger's legacy is that contradiction, the permanent tension between philosophical achievement and moral disaster. Trying to eliminate the tension by choosing one side or the other misses what his case reveals about philosophy's relationship to ethics, about brilliance's relationship to wisdom. His students scattered across the intellectual landscape, each working through the inheritance differently. Arendt returned to him personally while developing political philosophy that implicitly criticized his evasions. Marcuse demanded accountability and received only deflection. Levinas built an entire ethics around what Heidegger's philosophy omitted, the face-to-face encounter with another person that places absolute demands on us. Each response testified to the problem's persistence. The black notebooks guarantee this conversation continues, private journals revealing how anti-Semitic themes integrated into philosophical thinking, not kept separate, but woven through reflections on being and history. Defenders who argued his philosophy transcended his politics face harder questions now. The separation they wanted to maintain keeps collapsing under archival evidence. Yet his influence spreads regardless. Existentialism, hermeneutics, deconstruction, postmodern theory, environmental philosophy all carry Heideggerian DNA. You can trace lines from being and time through Sartre to contemporary debates about freedom and responsibility. From his analysis of understanding through Gadamer to how we think about interpretation today. From his language philosophy through Derrida to deconstruction's ongoing influence. The genealogy is too extensive to sever. This creates an uncomfortable situation where philosophy departments teach someone whose politics were abhorrent while trying to extract valuable insights from contaminated sources. It's intellectually honest but ethically queasy, requires constant vigilance, always asking where concepts lead, what they enable, what they obscure. The technology critique offers clearest example of this double-edged inheritance. His analysis of how modern technical thinking reduces everything to standing reserve, to calculable resource, captures something real about industrial capitalism's logic. But he also compared the Holocaust to mechanized agriculture, reducing mass murder to illustration of technological inframing. The insight and the obscenity come from the same source. You can learn from the insight while condemning the obscenity. Must actually, if you're going to engage seriously with 20th century philosophy. But you can't forget the connection. Can't treat him like any other thinker whose biographical details matter less than concepts. His life choices became part of what his concepts mean. The question of what Heidegger reveals about philosophy itself remains most troubling. If someone this philosophically sophisticated could make such catastrophic political choices, what does that say about philosophy's value? Does deep thinking about being and existence actually make anyone better? Or does it just make them better at rationalizing whatever they've already decided? The answer seems to be that philosophical brilliance operates independently from ethical wisdom, that you can be extraordinarily insightful about some aspects of existence while remaining blind to others. That abstract thinking creates dangerous distance from concrete human suffering if not constantly anchored in ethical concern for actual people. Heidegger demonstrated this disconnect at the highest level, could analyse Dasein's care structure with extraordinary subtlety while showing no care for Jews being murdered, could write about being toward death while remaining indifferent to millions dying, could emphasise authenticity while living through profound inauthenticity. The philosophical sophistication and the moral failure weren't opposed forces within him. They coexisted, possibly even reinforced each other. This is the uncomfortable lesson. Philosophy offers no ethical guarantee, doesn't automatically make practitioners better humans, might even enable certain kinds of evasion, providing abstract categories that obscure concrete responsibilities. The philosopher asking about being can forget about beings, can lose sight of suffering individuals in pursuit of systematic understanding. His post-war silence completed the failure. When Germany confronted what happened, when survivors testified and documentation emerged, When the full scope of atrocity became undeniable, Heidegger said nothing meaningful about victims, spoke of Germany's suffering, but not Germany's crimes, deflected questions about responsibility, protected his reputation rather than acknowledging truth. That silence echoes through every page of his collected works now. The 100 volumes of lectures and essays and private notes, this enormous record of one mind's attempt to think being, all of it shadowed by what he refused to think about. The actual human cost of the regime he supported, the faces of those who suffered while he philosophized about care and authenticity. Emmanuel Levinas built his ethics around precisely this recognition. That philosophy begins not with abstract questions about being, but with the face of the other person making absolute demands. That the other's vulnerability creates responsibility that can't be evaded through philosophical abstraction. That ethics is first philosophy, not a subsidiary concern that comes after ontology. Levinas learned this partly by seeing what Heidegger's approach enabled. When being becomes more important than beings, when the question of existence overshadows questions about how we treat existing persons, dangerous evasions become possible. Philosophy that brackets ethics, that treats concern for others as secondary to concern for being itself, creates space for catastrophic failure. The Heidegger case forces recognition that philosophical importance and moral failure can coexist completely. That influence and contamination aren't opposites, but can be simultaneous aspects of the same legacy. That we inherit both, can't take one without encountering the other, must learn to think critically with and against him simultaneously. His work will continue being read because the questions he raised don't disappear. What does it mean for anything to exist? How does time structure human experience? What constitutes authentic existence? These questions remain urgent, regardless of who asked them or how they answered. But they're asked now in awareness that asking about existence while ignoring existing people's suffering isn't profound philosophy. It's profound failure. The boy from Meeskirch who became obsessed with being's meaning demonstrated that meaning itself means nothing without justice. That ontology detached from ethics isn't deep philosophy, but dangerous abstraction. That the question of being must always circle back to the question of how we treat beings, how we live with others, what we owe to those who suffer. This is the lesson his life teaches, not the lesson he intended, but the one his choices made unavoidable. Martin Heidegger changed how we think about existence and showed us that thinking about existence without ethical commitment is worthless. That philosophical brilliance without moral wisdom is worse than ignorance because it provides sophisticated tools for evading basic human responsibilities. The tension between his philosophical achievement and his moral catastrophe will never resolve. Can't be resolved because both are real, both matter, both demand acknowledgement. We're left holding contradictions, learning from insights while recognizing their limits, taking what's valuable while rejecting what's poisonous, always aware that the boundary between insight and poison isn't as clear as we'd like. Every future philosopher working in phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, or continental philosophy generally works in his shadow, must decide how to engage this legacy, what to preserve and what to reject, how to think with and against him simultaneously. The decision isn't optional, his influence is too extensive to avoid, but neither is ignoring what he enabled. The final accounting shows a life that asked fundamental questions and answered them catastrophically. A mind that saw deeply into certain structures of existence while remaining blind to elementary moral demands. A body of work that opened new philosophical territories while supporting political movements that closed human possibilities forever. Achievement and disaster intertwine so completely that neither can be understood apart from the other. That intertwining is the legacy, not the philosophy alone or the politics alone, but their terrible combination. Not the question of being separated from the question of justice, but their collision in one life that demonstrates why they can never be separated. Philosophy after Heidegger must be philosophy aware that philosophical sophistication offers no protection against moral catastrophe. That brilliant analysis of existence doesn't guarantee decent treatment of existing persons.